Welcome to the Unified Brand Podcast, brought to you by Elements Brand Management, a weekly brand building and brand strategy podcast to help you unlock your brand's potential, stand out from the competition, and create impact. So today we're joined by Jamie Dixon, a storytelling coach who's helped leaders of over 160 multinational companies master the skill of influence, creator of the Story Habit methodology, and author of the new book, The Story Habit: How Leaders Shape Stories That Drive Action. Great to have you back on the Unified Brand Podcast, Jamie. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, what you do, and why storytelling is important?
Thank you for having me again. It's good to be with you again, Chris. And yeah, I work as a coach and trainer in the field of leadership development. I'm currently based in China, although we'll be moving to the UK in the next few months. And the big focus of my work is on helping leaders increase their influence. There's several ways that I help leaders increase their influence, but one of them is through storytelling. And the book I've just published, The Story Habit, is all about storytelling and making the skill of storytelling a habit that you can use to bring more meaning to daily conversations. And one important idea in the story habit is that storytelling is not just about telling stories. It's also about, and probably more importantly, about shaping the stories that people believe in. That's a brief overview of the story habit.
So when you say shaping the stories that people believe in, what do you mean by that? And how can people start to think about stories and how they shape them in their daily lives?
So I think as an example, right now in the UK, we've got Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss trying to win the hearts of the nation to become the next prime minister. And they are trying to shape the story that people have about them. They are trying to get people to believe in a story that causes people to vote for them to be the next prime minister. When we talk about shaping the stories that people believe in, it's ultimately about the beliefs and the narratives that people are using to make decisions, to take action, to guide their behavior. And that comes out in all shapes and forms. It could be politics, it could be culture, it could be history. For example, right now in China believes Taiwan is a renegade province. Taiwan obviously believes a different story. And so it comes up in all sorts of ways. And probably the way most related to the topic of your podcast is branding. And what stories do people have about brands? We look at Apple, for example, and Apple clearly has lots of lovers and haters who each share different stories about the brand of Apple and what Apple represents. And so that's what I mean by shaping the stories that people believe in.
It's interesting because I was at a recent sort of coaching session, like masterclass type thing, and there was the topic of Apple came up. And I said, well, for me, Apple is a great brand. I end up buying everything that they released, kind of thing. Like I'm always there. They've got me for life is one of the things I said, I think, in that session. And someone literally next to me said, I absolutely hate Apple. I'll never buy anything from them. I'm always going to get like Samsung or something like that. So there was kind of this diametrically opposed side of things. Something I've read about is, when you're on the right track, when you have strong opinion on both sides in terms of people that love your brand and people that hate your brand. So you have this, it means you've clearly defined who you are. Is that something that story does? Does it actually create that sort of line in the sand and those two sets of sort of that tribe mentality?
I think it should, because the first part of storytelling and the first part of my framework, relate, challenge, resolve, is that the story has to relate to people. And if it's going to relate to people, it can't relate to everyone. It has to relate to people who understand it, who share common values, common life experiences. And if you're trying to, a classic mistake in marketing that small businesses make is they try to market to everyone and say their services are for everyone. And it just doesn't work because that doesn't relate to anyone. So you have to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, this is who we are. This is what's important to us. And specifically with stories, a story is always about a character in a situation the audience can relate to. And that character will have traits, life experiences, values, and so on that shape who they are. And as the audience are reading, watching, or listening to that story, they will see some of themselves in that character. And Some people will love the character in that story, some people won't. And that's because everyone's different and it will only relate to specific people. So I think that is an important part of story, and probably a sign that you've got a really powerful story when you're relating to one set of people in particular and not another set of people. At the same time, that can really, really backfire in some ways. I mentioned this in the last episode with you. Chinese brands right now are really, really struggling in Western markets in particular, and probably a lot of other markets, because the brand of China and anything related to China just alienates people in the West right now. And it's causing big, big problems for Chinese companies. They're losing business and losing a lot of money because of that. They relate too well to the Chinese audience. Maybe not too well, but they relate really, really well to the Chinese audience. But the Chinese audience and Western audiences' values, beliefs, what they stand for has divided so far that it's starting to impact on business. So can also go both ways, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one of the things when we're working with clients that we see sometimes is, and I don't know how much this affects as well, what you see with storytelling, but when companies are talking to the wrong audience, the big problem is talking to everyone, like you said, but also they're focusing their efforts on the wrong audience, or their brand is geared up to an audience that actually isn't their core demographic. There's been a few times where we've done some research and actually realized that their target audience is a completely different audience that's interacting with their messaging and their brand as a whole. Whereas they are trying to target this other audience and they're trying to speak to them, but it's actually resonate with someone else. Do you find that with storytelling, how it can kind of, if you don't have a handle on it, you can be talking to the completely wrong people, and the people you want to be reaching are actually crying out for the message that you're trying to get across?
Yeah, I have a saying that your story is never about you. It's always about the audience. And I think you don't always know what your story is about until you get it out there and people start giving you feedback. For example, the story habit, it's only been out for a week or so now. And I wrote it specifically for leaders, and that's who I'm aiming it at. And I've already got lots of people saying, wow, this is really applicable to teaching or to life, or even here to branding as well. I've got lots of different people finding what's related to them. And, I do also have my target audience saying as well, this I completely get. But you're better off telling your story, testing it, and seeing who responds best to it. And I give a little example from my own personal experience. I do a lot of work here in Asia, and a particular niche that I've really honed in on is I help Asian leaders influence their stakeholders in multinational companies, particularly Asian leaders influencing senior leaders in Europe and the US. And because due to cultural and regional differences, that can be a really big challenge. And I started reaching out to people on LinkedIn, just connecting and messaging and presenting my pitch. And at first I was targeting smaller companies because I thought, they're growing. If I get in early, cool. And I really like the idea of working with smaller companies because I can get in at the very, very senior level. I can have a much bigger impact on them. But the feedback I was getting was, we don't have those issues. We haven't grown to the size where we have those issues. So then I increased the size of the company I was targeting, and I started to get feedback like, oh yeah, we have those problems. So your story is not about you, it's about your audience. And you don't always know who your story is going to impact until you start telling it and start getting that feedback. And I think that's a massive mistake that entrepreneurs, solopreneurs in particular, and myself included, make when it comes to business. Because we have these ideas of what business we want to do. And we download these templates on how to create a customer avatar. And this is our dream customer. And then we go and target this customer and we discover they don't care. And what we would be much better off doing is at first kind of throwing our story out in lots of different directions and seeing which one sticks the most. That can be quite surprising, the results you get when you do that. So your story is never about you, it's always about the audience. And wait to see what the audience respond with.
I like the idea of testing that message initially to see where that sticks, where that fits in. So in terms of mistakes, you mentioned one mistake there, but what are some other mistakes you see either leaders or even companies making when it comes to storytelling? What are the ones that they cause them to not have the best results they could do?
So, for example, if I think of leaders in particular, a common mistake using the terminology of my framework is they don't relate before challenging. Challenging is always about changing people's minds and pointing out the flaws in the stories people currently believe in and offering them a better story for them. But in order to do that, you have to relate to people first. You have to show you get them, you understand them. I think a good example is the Great Resignation right now. And all of these companies that are saying, come back to the office after people have spent the last year and a half working from home. And a lot of people are saying, no, I don't want to come back to the office. And now you're hearing some companies are drawing a line in the sand and saying, either you come back to the office or don't come back at all. And some people are like, okay, well, I won't come back at all. And what they're doing is they're challenging without relating. These leaders don't realize that the life experiences people have had over the last year and a half have changed the stories they believe in. And now people are starting to realize that, we don't need an office for so much of the work that we do anymore. It's a legacy from the industrial era that just isn't as relevant anymore. And now a lot of people have had enough of the relevant experiences to help them realize that there's no point to this. And so as a leader, if you are in this situation, you are challenging people and say, don't be lazy, stop working from home, come to the office, otherwise you're going to get fired. And people are resisting that. It's a sign that you're not relating. And you have to go back and relate to them first. I think another little tangent from this particular example is people's stories change. And you can think that you understand them, but after a period of time, people have been through particular experiences that completely change them. So I'm going to experience that pretty soon when I move back to the UK in about 6 months' time. That'll be the first time I've lived in the UK in 16 years. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be very, very different from how it was, the last time I lived there. Was just about the launch of the first iPhone. It's going to be incredibly difficult. And I'm sure I'm going to struggle to relate in many ways. And I'm going to have to spend a lot of time relearning how things work there. And then after I've been in the UK for a while and I go back to China on holiday, I'm going to discover I've been away for a few months and things have already changed in China. And I'm just going to be an alien wherever I go. But people's stories change. And so if you find that you are challenging people and they're not responding the way you want, don't continue challenging. Go back to relating because you don't understand their story anymore. It's changed.
That's really powerful to think about that because you're right. I mean, as audiences change and grow, if I think about it from a branding point of view, business point of view, as audiences change and grow, different life experiences, different things happen to them as they go through that evolution. It might even be through your content. Your content's educated them to a point where those challenges that they originally started with are now different. They're in a different place. So then obviously the message and the things that they're trying to achieve have changed. So I think that's really important for businesses and brands to constantly reevaluate where they are, where their audience is, what the challenges that they face are. So do you have any tips in terms of relate, challenge, resolve? How would you approach that? What's a good way to think about relating? How can you set that up to win?
Just before this podcast, you and I were having a conversation about branding and brands in particular. And we were saying that if you want to be a really strong and powerful brand, it has to be like a marriage with your customer. You need to be in frequent contact and communication with your customer. If I use my particular example, I work in leadership development. And, I've been doing this for a decade. There's particular things that are always common issues. And it would be so easy for me to believe and assume that I understand what they're going through. But even these days, I walk into the training room and they're talking about ESG, environment, sustainability, governance. They weren't talking about that several years ago. They're talking about working from home. We used to say classroom training. Now we call it offline training, which is a really bizarre term for me. And I'm really grateful that I'm still actually interacting with these people and hearing what's going on. But all of these changes I keep hearing remind me that I need to understand on a much deeper level. And the only way you get that is direct interaction with your customer, your client, your partner, your consumer. And I think even companies as powerful as Apple, for example, would run the risk of suddenly losing huge amounts of business because they don't relate anymore to their customer. I don't know if Apple will experience that problem because they have a lot of data about their customers, and maybe they understand their customers much better than the customers understand themselves. But you have to always have that interaction with the customer. You have to know what's changing. What are they going through right now? What is important to them right now? Not 6 months ago, right now. And that just comes back to good old-fashioned communication.
So why do you think storytelling is important for businesses and leaders?
Well, storytelling is ultimately about making meaning. And you can have the best idea ever, but if you can't attach meaning to that idea or communicate it in a way that's meaningful, then that idea will have no impact on your audience. And a fun example is if you have a painting made by Vincent van Gogh and another painting, which is a replica done by a student. You look at both of these paintings, they are exactly the same thing. But if you put them up for auction, the Vincent van Gogh one is going to sell for millions and millions more than the replica. And the only difference is the story behind it. And value is all a story. Value is entirely subjective. We might even think that value is objective because we have money and we can touch money or we can see the digits on the screen, but even that is subjective. Like imagine if all of a sudden the internet just stopped working, Bitcoin would lose value, all of your digital banking would stop working, you wouldn't have access to your money in there. And then maybe you go back to cash. Well, okay, now cash is valuable again, but imagine a zombie apocalypse breaks out and society collapses. And now all money is good for is toilet paper, basically. It's all dependent on what people believe. And maybe I should be careful about the brand names I use, but let's take a famous drink that begins with C that is packed full of sugar. My friend refers to as the devil's wee wee. It is so unhealthy, so unhealthy, so bad for you. And everyone knows it's bad for you, but it is such a big brand. And again, it's the story. When people see that drink, they have the little jingle in their mind. They know the feeling, that buzz it gives them before it gives them the inevitable sugar crash. And the brand imagery they've been exposed to since they've been born on TV adverts and banners all over the place has really shaped that story. And if imagine that brand didn't exist and not even a drink like that existed today, and all of a sudden some entrepreneur comes and says, I've got this drink, it gives people a sugar high, it does have a sugar crash, tastes really good, it could kind of make you overweight and give you cancer and so on. So yeah, here it is. Who wants to buy it? No one would want to buy it. But the reason that drink in particular has been so successful is because that company has done an amazing job of influencing the stories people believe in about it. And that's why storytelling is so important, because value is not objective. It's purely subjective, and it's all attached to stories. And you can be really, really good at whatever it is that you do. You can be really good at researching, at coding, programming, engineering, but you will reach a point in your career where your technical skills will only take you so far. And to go any further, you need to have that ability to make an impact with your ideas. You can have the best ideas out there, but if they don't impact your stakeholders, your customers, whoever, your ideas won't go anywhere. So I believe storytelling is absolutely essential for leaders, and not just telling stories, but more importantly, making meaning with the ideas that you're trying to communicate. If you can't do that, you really won't go very far in your career.
That's a really good summation. I think just to shoot back a second, when you were talking about zombie apocalypses and cash, I can tell when someone's telling me a good story because I visualize. So I'll start visualizing things. So I started to visualize being in a zombie apocalypse and having a handful of cash. And I thought the only thing it's good to be used for is just imagine yourself throwing pound coins at zombies, just kind of like, in the hope it might stave them off a bit for a little bit of time. So yeah, that was a great analogy. And yeah, I think you're right with like Coke and the stories that brands tell and how they can develop that narrative and shape that narrative. And I always say that branding is about taking control of the narrative of your business, essentially. That's what branding is. And a brand is not something that is a company owns, it's something that's owned out there in the audience's mind. And the branding part of it is the company's attempts to shape that narrative, shape that, like you said, that story in the marketplace, and through design, through strategy, through messaging, through positioning, creating that relevancy with their audience so that the audience has those positive emotions, those positive interactions that build up over time with a consistent approach that builds that brand in the audience's mind. So I think that's, it's really interesting how that can be developed. So from your point of view, it's like a quick approach to developing a story. We've got relate, challenge, resolve. How would that go to building a short narrative that could be used by a leader or business sort of today kind of thing? How would you get them to use that? What would be the process you would say to them if they had like a crisis message they want to get out, or just something to get out to their audience?
So in each of the relate, challenge, resolve parts, I have little tools and techniques, which I also summarize into habits as well. I think there's three things in particular that you can use in all of these that I call the three ingredients of stories. Because relate, challenge, resolve, if I use an analogy, relate, challenge, resolve is like the protein, the vegetables, and the staple of any meal. They're essential, but there's something still missing. You also need the flavoring, the spices. And this is what I call the three ingredients of stories. And you can use these individually anytime. And so the three ingredients of stories: 1, show, don't tell; 2, metaphors and analogies; and 3, contrast. So show, don't tell, the idea is speak to the senses, not the mind. If you want people to believe that your app is the solution for them, don't tell them, show them. Let them experience it for themselves. If your idea, maybe you're on a phone call and you can't physically show them, you don't have time to, and so you want to think of a way of getting that through to them, you can still show, don't tell through language by using words that speak to the senses instead of the intellect. And this kind of language is what we call vivid language. So if I say the sentence, don't think of chocolate ice cream, everyone's going to be thinking of chocolate ice cream, because in that sentence, the only words connected to the senses are chocolate ice cream. When you hear those words, boom, you have pictures, scents, tastes, etc. come up into your imagination. But the words don't think, they are not connected to the senses, and those just don't go into your mind. They don't have an impact. So show, don't tell, either literally show people or use vivid language that speaks to the senses. That's something that books do amazingly well. When you are reading the words in a book, they're playing a movie in your mind. And like you were saying earlier, you're listening to my zombie apocalypse example, you've got that movie playing in your mind. So show, don't tell. The second one is metaphors and analogies. In practical terms, a metaphor and analogy are pretty much exactly the same thing. But the idea with a metaphor and analogy is we all think in patterns, and we learn to process certain patterns really well, and other patterns we don't learn, but other people learn. And this creates a communication gap. So for example, if I go to the doctors and I have a blood test, they'll print out a report with all these numbers on, and the doctor will go, look at this report, you see here. And I'll look at the report and I don't see anything. I just see numbers. But the doctor sees patterns in those numbers. It's like a pilot in a cockpit. They look at all of the indicators, they see patterns, whereas I go there, I don't see anything. And the way of bridging this kind of gap is to use a pattern as like the pattern you understand, that is also a pattern the audience understands really, really well. And an example I like to use is a while ago, we bought a laptop for my father-in-law to watch movies on. And after a few months, the hard drive started to slow down a lot. And he's like, why is the computer so slow? Well, it's because the hard drive is full. What's a hard drive? Well, it's like a fridge. When you go to the vegetable market and you bring vegetables back home, you need to store the vegetables in the fridge. Hard drive is exactly the same. When you download movies, you need a place to store the movies. And just like a fridge, when you've got so many vegetables in the fridge, you need to spend hours looking for the older vegetables and you can't put new vegetables in. And a hard drive is exactly the same. So metaphors and analogies, using something that the audience understands really well, and some really safe categories for metaphors and analogies are typically nature. Everyone understands nature. That's just nature. We've all spent time in nature. We all know what nature is. You can find a lot of really powerful metaphors and analogies in nature. And the third ingredient is contrast. And if I say to you, for example, we sold 143 units in June, so what? That doesn't mean anything. But if I say, on average, we sell 6 units a month. Wow. Now we have a contrast. And where there is contrast, there's a story, because within that, there is a change, there is a difference. And a story is always about change. A story is never, I got on the subway, I went to work, I came home, I went to bed. A story is always, I got on the subway, it broke down, and something happened. There was a change. This is the most powerful way of communicating facts and statistics, numbers. Always show the number in contrast with something else. And then the audience sees a story in there, and then they want to know more about the story. So in summary, show, don't tell, use metaphors and analogies, and use contrast. So really simple and powerful ways of using storytelling skills to bring more meaning to everyday conversations.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, analogy and metaphor is something that I lean on quite a bit, and I use quite a lot, to the detriment. My wife doesn't always appreciate it because I'll use really complex metaphors sometimes. So she just goes, just tell me what you mean. Just tell me what you mean. So I think that if I can find like that common kind of thing, like you said, nature, or like you used there with the fridge analogy, which was really good because it's kind of something that everybody has an experience with. I think that's a really good way of looking at things. And it does help. You definitely see that. One of the things why I love branding and that sort of things is symbolism's a little bit like that. Symbolism is kind of, you're creating an analogy or a logo or an idea around what the business is. You're kind of trying to create that shorthand that someone can connect to. And it's a bit abstract, but there is something there that they can connect to and relate to. But also, like you said, when you develop a brand, there is that analogy almost of a shift in between, that translation in between, which I think is really important. So can every leader or business make stories a habit and bring them into their sort of day-to-day?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the reason I wrote the story habit, because I think when we hear about storytelling, it sounds like this out of reach ability that only the most charismatic or imaginative or creative people can use and develop. But in reality, it's actually really, really simple. It's really simple. And what I described earlier of the 3 ingredients of stories, I'm sure people listening to this, that's not new. It's things that they knew already and maybe just don't practice enough. And the key to making storytelling a story habit is to practice those things more in day-to-day conversations. And there are so many opportunities every single day. And I have 3 I's, which I think represent the 3 typical situations where you can use story habits: impact, influence, and inspire. When you have an idea that you need to get through to people, that's the impact part. Maybe you're trying to explain a difficult concept or how a product works or how you could help a customer. You can use storytelling there. Influence, when you want to change people's minds, you want to get approval from your stakeholder for a budget. You want to ask a customer to sign a contract for an even bigger order or whatever. Again, you can use these storytelling habits, techniques to achieve that and inspire. When you want people to take action, you can do that. Again, you can use story habits to get them to take action, to focus in on the little things that you need them to do and make those so clear that all they can do is just do it. So there's a lot of opportunities in day-to-day conversations. It shouldn't be a skill that is so complicated and requires Hollywood levels of creative genius. It's something everyone can do if you just practice the right habits. It's a lot easier than people think.
Of course, it's like working out. The more you practice those habits, the better you get at it.
Yeah, exactly. And the more you notice the opportunities to use it, and then the more you start using it, and then the easier it becomes. And suddenly you have this massive pool of analogies and metaphors that you can use to communicate the ideas you frequently have to communicate and so on. It just grows from there. If you just start with the simplest little habits, it will grow naturally from there.
That's cool. So what's the hope for the book? What's the hope for you and where it goes now? What would you like the impact to be of the book?
Well, for people reading the book, I hope that they are able to take away at least a few of the habits. I've listed 16 habits in there and have explained in depth each one and how it works and when you can use it. And if people can use just a few of those habits, then I'll be very happy if they can do that. On a bigger level, I do a lot of training, or more particular for the story habit, coaching to help leaders develop those habits and bridge the communication gaps that they face on a day-to-day basis. And on an even bigger level, at some point, I'll start certifying story habit coaches so they can start training the methodology on their own. So I have big hopes for the story habit going forward.
We've just put together a weekly brand tip video series, which is designed to help you to unlock your brand's potential and stand out from the competition. And if you're interested, if you just go to elementsbrandmanagement, all one word, .co.uk/weekly-brand-tips, sign up and you'll be delivered a 3 to 5 minute video a week straight to your inbox. I'll put a link in the show notes if you're interested. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to receive more, you can subscribe in all the usual places. We're talking iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher. Please, if you get a chance, rate and review. It helps the podcast to kind of get a bit more visibility and allows us to keep on producing these podcasts. Have a great week. Catch up soon. Keep those brands unified.